The time has come. Welcome back to Brandon Farm. It's been a hot minute since I've done a YouTube video. I've been doing a whole bunch of YouTube shorts, Instagram reels, things like that. So if you're following us on Instagram, great. If you're not, go over there and follow us. Today is... We're struggling with this phone. There we go. Okay. Today is Easter Sunday. And I thought, what better day than to do a worm farm series. So I've been doing a series on Instagram. It's a 10-part series going all through what it takes to worm farm. Basically worm farming 101. Giving you all the resources, all the tips, all the tricks, all the information that I have to help you guys feel confident to start your own worm farm. For those of you that don't know, I've been asked by our Horticulture Club here in Wise County to give a presentation on worm farming, and also our homestead group to do a presentation on worm farming. So to prepare for those presentations, I've been doing a series, like I said. So for YouTube's sake, instead of doing it in parts, I'm just going to do it all in one video. So this is going to be worm farming 101. Let's define worm farming. What is worm farming? I have a whole notebook here, in case you were wondering. I take lots of notes. I want to give you the correct information. All of the information that I can give you. Let's define vermicomposting. So vermicomposting is different than vermiculture. Vermicomposting is the use of the worms to convert the waste material into like a humus-rich soil additives or natural fertilizers. It's the byproduct of worm composting, consisting of worm castings, microorganisms, and unprocessed organic material. It can be harvested and used to improve the quality of your soil, which provides essential nutrients for growing plants. So simply, you've got your worms, they're decomposing all the organic matter. Microorganisms that are in there are adding benefits and additives to your soil, then in turn grow bigger, healthier plants. So vermiculture is different than vermicomposting, being that vermiculture is just simply the culture of the worms. It's the act of raising, hatching, breeding earthworms. So that's what we're doing. We're vermiculturing over here, if you will. All right, it's the natural breaking down of the organic matter, turning it around and putting it back into your earth to add those nutrients back into your soil and those microorganisms. So what are the benefits of worm farming? Like I said, it's essential for healthier soil, altering the soil structure, nutrient dynamics, plant growth, and movement of water. So when you've got the earthworms and they're burrowing down and they're making all these little holes, it's allowing that water to seep through and kind of, make channels through your soil, therefore improving your soil structure. Why do I worm farm? I worm farm for a couple of reasons. One, I find it very fascinating and interesting. Number two, it's very easy. It's very hands-off. Anybody can worm farm. And I have this garden, right? And I have all these plants in my greenhouse, and I can turn around and I can harvest the castings. I can harvest the compost, and I can add that back to my garden or back to my seedlings to get bigger, healthier plants. It's an organic fertilizer. Instead of using this is organic back here, but like a Miracle-Gro situation, a lot of those aren't organic. If you want to stay organic, then you have to, switch over. So your castings are an organic material. This fish fertilizer back here is an organic material. So that's why I worm farm. I just find it very interesting. Matter of fact, I created these little cheat sheet cards, Grow Messy Worms. But on the back, they have a bunch of just tips and tricks that I will be passing out in our presentation. Part 3 of our part 10. And like I said, this is just going to be a full overview of what I'm going to cover in the presentation. What kind of worms? So what kind of worms? And actually, I need to add, where are you getting your worms? So let's go over types of worms. So there's a few different types. I also have this book, Worm Farming 101, Pat Blackburn. I got it off of Amazon. It's been a huge resource. So let's go over types of worms. And I purchased Natalie's Hey It's a Good Life worm course. And that's what I learned most of my worm farming stuff from, other than like I said, Captain Matt has a good resource. And in her book, she's got types of composting worms. We have 2 different types of composting worms. We have the red wigglers and we have the European night crawlers. So the red wigglers are probably the most common because they're considered to be the best species at vermicomposting. They can eat half of its weight in food daily, efficient at breaking down decaying organic matter. The European or the African night crawler is a cousin to the red wiggler, but the night crawlers are much larger and they can survive underwater for long periods of time, which who knew? You can always find them burrowing in compost piles or burrowing in piles of manure. 2 other ones that I want to mention are the red tiger, which we don't have, and the blue worms. Now, the blue worms are considered tropical, which I find fascinating. And are they really blue? I don't know. So those are the types of worms. We got our worms from Mimi's Worms. If you Google, composting worms, I think hers is one of the first ones to pop up. So anyway, we just ordered Mimi's Worms, and we've been worm farming for probably right around a year. So I've had the same worms that just keep breeding and reproducing, and those are our worms that we work with for composting. So now that we've talked about what kind of worms, we've defined worm composting, we've talked about the benefits of worm farming. So now we're going to move on to the materials needed for worm farming. Now it's quite the list. So materials needed. So first thing you're going to think about is what kind of worm bin do I want? Okay, so there's a few different kinds. You've got your stackable bins, which we have a stackable worm farm. I just got it off of Walmart. I can try to link it below. At first I wasn't sure about it. I didn't really care for it, but then as time goes on, I actually kind of like it. It's a smaller worm farm. It's easier to harvest. The bigger, worm situation you have, the longer it's going to take to get all of that out and harvested. We have the stackable bin, and it's 3 tiers, and you would just layer each bin, and then you stack it on top of each other and make sure you're making it all moist and whatever. But you do have to end up feeding all 3 bins if there's worms in all 3 bins. So there's downfalls and there's good things to it. It just it's going to depend on your space and what you want out of your worm farm. Another worm farm is like a traditional bin. So a traditional bin worm farm is like, say this tote here. This would be a traditional bin. And we also have a traditional bin worm farm. It does not have a lid on it. That might be something that we look into in the future because it does dry out that top layer. But we have like a big Purina cattle cube bucket that we use for our traditional worm bin. But you could use like one of these buckets, or even smaller than this. Is what I'm going to do in the presentation. I'm going to raffle off a traditional worm bin, complete worm farm with worms and everything. I'm going to take 2 of these Rubbermaid bins, smaller than this. The first bin that sits in there with all of my layers and my worms is going to have holes in the bottom, and it'll sit in the same bin with no holes. That way it'll catch all of that water that drips through, if any. But that would be your traditional worm bin. Then you have a flow-through worm bin system. Now, Captain Matt, I'm going to reference him because he has a massive flow-through system that you would build like out of wood. And the idea is the same. You would still have all of your layers, but at the bottom you have like PVC runners, and you would just grate underneath, and that would be your harvesting. So in theory, it sounds easier to harvest like your castings and your compost and everything, because everything gets moved to the bottom, and then you would just scrape it out and it kind of just falls, and you would have something to catch it all. I think eventually we will attempt to build a flow-through system, because I think on that level, then I could maybe try to breed worms or sell worms, like for fishing or for people to start their own worm farms. I kind of want to explore that avenue a little bit further. Another system would be like a worm bed. Now this one sounds a little crazy to me. Basically, you would section off like a piece of earth. So like instead of a raised bed garden, you would have like a raised bed worm farm. So same concept. You would have like a border. You would have a piece of earth that you would use. You could essentially layer it and your worms would be like free range worms, like your free range chickens. I'm not sure how you would harvest that, thinking about that, but it is a possibility. All right, so once you have your worm bin figured out, what type of worm bin you want to do, then you're going to need your materials list to be able to layer that worm bin. So some things that you can use: shredded cardboard, shredded paper. You're going to need some sort of grit, and grit is going to be like sand or dirt, perlite or vermiculite. You're going to need water, preferably unchlorinated. Any kind of like the paper, like the packing paper that comes in, like the Amazon boxes and whatnot, that brown packing paper. You can use straw, leaves, leaf mold. Leaf mold is a good one, but from what I hear, leaf mold takes a minute to get it to be leaf mold. Essentially, you'd be creating like a compost bin just for your leaves, and you put your leaves in there and it eventually becomes like a decomposed like leaf mold, and you can use that. Coconut core is another good one. The coconut core you can just buy off of Amazon, like the cores, and then you would just add water and it would expand, and then you can use the coconut core. You can also use peat moss. You can use cover plants. So like when you, in the winter, you plant your cover crops. Once you pull those out, you can use that inside your worm bin. And you can also use wood chips. Preferably like a broken down wood chip would be better. So that's your materials needed. And again, on the back of this Grow Messy Worm card, it kind of tells you I have grit. What is grit? What are your greens and what are your browns? Greens would be healthy garden clippings, grass clippings, fruit and vegetable scraps, and peels. Your browns are leaves, shredded cardboard, and paper and packing paper, and newspaper. So it's got a little list on here, a little cheat sheet. So that's going to go into your materials list after you've decided what kind of worm bin you want to go with. So after we've decided what worm bin, we have our materials ready, another thing we want to consider is where are we going to put our worm bin? This is kind of a big thing, and I just had somebody reach out to me on Instagram and say that they just killed all of their worms because it got too hot. And I have to say, I'm guilty of the same thing. I tried a worm farm in a 5-gallon bucket. I put it out, I think it was on our front porch, and I cooked them all. So you want to be cautious on where you put your worm bin. Currently, like I said, we have 2 worm bins going. We have a stackable bin and we have a traditional bin. Now I have put them in our garage, closest to our garage door. I don't want them on an exterior door or an exterior wall, I should say, because I feel like it's gonna get too hot or it's gonna be too cold. So I put them more towards the interior of our house, but they're in the garage, and it's been working perfect. I have had them on the front porch in a bigger container, and they were okay. I did have them inside for a long time, but with that you introduce like gnats and a smell and whatever. I didn't care for them in the house, so I moved them in the garage and they're doing just fine. Your ideal temp is anywhere from 60 to 80 degrees. You want to keep them above 40 degrees. So someplace cool, someplace with good airflow. You can insulate, like if you're in cooler temperatures, like we're in the winter, you can insulate your bin a number of ways. One way is to like pre-soak your layers of like shredded cardboard and then put dry on top. You can also, this is a new one for me, and I haven't done it yet, but you can dig a hole in the ground and you can basically bury your worm bin and let the earth regulate your temperature. I mean, it sounds good, but you still have to pull it out to be able to harvest it. If it's too hot, some things that you can do, like if you're in a hotter climate, we're in Texas, zone 8A, and we give really hot summers. So what I do in the summer is you can either give your worms like ice cubes, or you can freeze your food scraps and then feed them frozen food scraps, which is what I do a lot. You can also freeze water bottles, and you can put those in your worm bin as well to kind of keep it a little bit on the cooler side. But watering your worm bin is always a good measure. Say hi to Lane. Say hi.
Hi.
Talking about worms. So those are just some things you can do to regulate your temperature on your worm bin. After we have decided where we're going to put our worm bin, where the best spot for it would be, the next step is to create the bin itself. So you have your bin, you either have a 3-bin stacking system or you have a traditional worm bin, whatever you are working with. Now it's time to fill it. So we have our materials list. One thing in this worm course of Natalie's Hey It's a Good Life, she has this little diagram on layering your worm bin. She literally tells you step by step on which layers and how thick you want to make your layers. And it's what I reference every single time I reset my worm bin. Now, again, I'm going to go back to this card. Grow Messy Worms. I have it on here. I put the little cheat sheet on here. So this is how you're going to layer your worm bin. So you want to start with like cardboard or a paper bag, anything that is like a base. I don't have a lot of paper bags and I don't really like to use my paper bags. I like to keep them. I know it's a weird thing, whatever. So I just use cardboard. So you want to layer your worm bin with cardboard or a paper bag. And each layer you want to really kind of wet your layer. Then you want to do your browns. So your browns is going to be next. Shredded packing paper, newspaper, cardboard, egg cartons, leaves work great. Leaves are good because they're free. All you got to do is go pick them up out of your yard. If you got a lot of trees, put them in those leaf bags is what I do. And I just keep them off to the side. So when I reset my worm bin, I already have leaves to use for my brown layer. Compost is next. So your compost, I usually just go to like Lowe's, Home Depot, wherever and get like a bag of organic compost, or you can use the compost that comes out of your worm bin. So say like your second time resetting your worm bin, you've got compost that you've now pulled out that you can put back in. And next is going to be, it says a sprinkle of food scraps and grit. So you just want to throw like couple banana peels, avocado peel, whatever. Your food scraps, just a layer of your food scraps, just enough, a sprinkle, and then grit. So your grit again is going to be your sand, your dirt, your vermiculite, perlite. You just want to sprinkle it on top. Give it a good soak, like water hose or your unchlorinated water. I just use a water hose. I don't unchlorinate my water, dechlorinate, whatever. I just use whatever comes out of the water hose. We've been fine. And then again, you're going to repeat those steps. You're going to go with your browns, your compost, food scraps, and grit. Then when you get to like the top layer, essentially, so you would just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer until you fill up your worm bin. Then you would add your worms and your food scraps and then your browns on top. So I usually just cover mine with a bunch of leaves. So another thing you can feed your worms is like a worm chow. So when we ordered from Mimi's Worms, they actually sent us a bag of worm chow, and you can make your own. There's tons of recipes online. It's basically like cornmeal and some other things. Another thing you can use is like chicken feed, the crumbles. That's a new one. That's the one that I want to test out because we don't have a lot of food scraps. We should, but we don't. That makes me have to rely on feeding them a different source. So feeding them like my own worm chow or the chicken feed crumbles. Okay, so that was part 6. Part 7 is what to feed your worms and what not to feed your worms. So this is a good one, and she also has this in module here. And I also put it on the cheat sheet card. So we're going to use our cheat sheet card. So Grow Messy Worms. What not to feed your worms. Garlic, meat, bones, dairy, citrus, oil, onions, spice, nightshades, and diseased plants. I am guilty of putting nightshades in there, like tomatoes and whatnot. We got the motor scooters going, I'm sorry. But avoid the rest of it. Like we don't put any dairy, we don't put any bones or meat in our worm farm. We try to keep all of that stuff out. So some things that you can feed your worms would be like soft fruits, pumpkin, coffee grounds, avocado, cornmeal, tea bags, oatmeal, veggie peels, root veggies, and healthy plant scraps. Those are some things to think about whenever you're feeding your worms. Okay, right here. So she's got this diagram in here on what to feed and what not to feed. Good little diagram you can reference. And then also grow messy worms. Okay, part 8, when and how to feed your worms. So we usually feed our worms once a week. Try to keep on a once a week schedule. That way I know how much they're eating, how long it's taking them to finish what I've fed them. That's just one thing you want to look at. So when you're pulling away that soil and you're going to pocket feed or wherever, if you're going to top feed and just cover it up, you just want to lay eyes on your worm farm and see what they've already eaten. If there's still a ton of scrap there that they haven't broken down yet, then I wouldn't feed them again. I'd wait until all that was gone. How to feed your worms. Okay, so I said pocket feed. Pocket feeding is you're feeding your worms in the pocket of your worm bin. So I pull the soil away and there's my little pocket. I would put my scraps in there, push that dirt back and cover it up with browns. It's one way to feed. You can top feed, where you would just you'd pull your top layer back of your browns, put your scraps on the top, and then put your browns back. Now, Captain Matt, I've watched him feed his worms, and it's very interesting because he'll just put it right on top, and then he'll put like a plastic cover over the top, because the worms don't like light. They want to stay away from the light. They want the darkness. So he puts that cover on top, and that would be like his browns on top, okay? And then the worms will come up and they'll just eat everything. And then when you pull that layer back, you can see them all. They're all right there. It's kind of crazy. So the way I feed is I usually push it down and then I'll cover it up. And actually she's got a little coloring page right here. Smash it down and add some browns. So she's smashing her food down, the food scraps, and then covering up with browns. Compost caddy is you can keep like a compost bucket in your kitchen or whatever and throw your food scraps in there for your worms, and then that way when you're ready to feed your worms, you just take that bucket out and you feed your worms. Part 9 is when to harvest your worm bin, materials needed to harvest, and your harvesting process. So I want to get into this. I don't know if I'm going to get into it today. I actually might do a whole separate YouTube video, and I've done separate videos on this before. So my husband, he created a sieve out of like 2x4s and like a metal like grating, basically. It's got a bunch of holes in it. I think it's like 3/4. Don't quote me on that. A sieve. So when to harvest your worm bin. Something to look out for is, number 1, how it looks visually. So you want it to be really dark in color, really earthy. You want all of your food scraps to be broken down, all of your leaves to be broken down, all of your compost to be broken down. It looks really rich in color. Another thing, it has like a rich, earthy smell to it. That's a good thing. It's a good sign. You want it to be really earthy. So that's when you're going to know when it's time to harvest your bin, is when everything in that bin has broken down and decomposed and is looking very composty. Okay, so how to harvest, your harvesting process. It's actually a big to-do, and I have a whole YouTube video on harvesting my worm bin. You can go reference that. I'll try to link it. So that's how you would harvest your worm bin, okay? You're basically separating out. Now, depending on what you want, what are your goals for your worm bin? Do you want just straight castings? Do you want worm compost? Do you want compost and worm castings? Usually whenever I harvest my bins, I do both. So I have a system on where I am getting out, you're basically picking out all of your worms and separating them, and that leaves you with basically your compost. And then your compost, you can sieve that out to get straight castings. So like these are just straight castings in here. And with the castings, you can sprinkle them in your garden, you can put them in your plant starch, you can put them in your house plants. You can also make a compost worm tea, and I'm going to do a whole video on worm tea. I'm actually trying to brew some right now, so that's coming. But you've got the castings to do your worm tea. Part 10 is making the worm tea. Like I said, I'm going to do a whole video on making worm tea, and then resources. So for resources, I'm going to put all of these in the description below. And actually, fun fact is the worm course from Hey It's a Good Life. So I'm going to link both of those in the description below. But a couple of resources I want to go over with you. A big one, a huge one for me is Hey It's a Good Life. Natalie, she's in California. She's been a major resource for me and a huge motivator to just let me know that I can do this. Of course, I'm going to be here. I'm a resource for you guys. Anything you need, just comment, send me a direct message, whatever. Some more resources is going to be Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. I think they're on YouTube. They also have a website. Same thing with Mimi's Worm Farm. She's got a YouTube channel and she's got a whole website. That's where we ordered our worms from. Another resource that I reference often is the Captain Matt's Worm Farm. He's on YouTube. He's got a lot of very educational videos, informational videos. So go check them out. Like again, I will link them all in the description below. So yeah, that is our entire worm farming 101. You can worm farm. Anyone can worm farm. Let me show you how video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this worm farming video. I hope this encourages you to make your own worm farm. Like I said, if you have any questions or comments, just drop it below or send me a message. Appreciate you guys watching and hanging out with us. Sorry for the background noise, but you know, these kids want to ride their motor scooters, so that's just what we got to deal with. So stay tuned for the worm compost tea video. That'll be coming out soon. And to reference a previous video is the how to layer your worm bin. I have a whole video on resetting your worm bin, so reference that. Anyway, thanks for hanging out with me, and we'll see you later. All right, as always, let's get that freeze frame. So we're gonna put Grow Messy Worms in our freeze frame. There we go. Okay, there's our freeze frame, Grow Messy Worms. If you're coming to the presentation, it's April 20th, Wise County Horticulture Club, and then I have another one coming up in May at the, I don't know, I think it's in Decatur. It's the Homestead Group. It's a club I haven't been to yet, but it's a club that I'm probably going to join. So anyway, we'll see you at the worm presentation. I hope you liked our video. We'll see you.